Well, good morning. Welcome to International Church. My name is Josh, and I'm the worship director and one of the elders here at International, where together we aim to help people love God, love people, serve, and engage the world. I'm happy to see all of you here this morning. We're going to dive into our second sermon in our study of the book of Esther. Now, I've titled this series For a Purpose. And last week we saw that Esther was chosen for a purpose. We saw that she was chosen through a set of difficult and challenging experiences. And we saw that her character shone through, that she shone like a light in the world. And because of that, because of her character, Xerxes chose her to be his new queen. Now, last week when we left Esther, she was the queen of the largest empire in the known world. Now, here you can see just how large the Persian Empire was under Esther. It was truly massive. And so Esther is queen of Persia. And today we're going to look at a large chunk of this story. Now, I'm not going to read the 5 chapters that we're going to cover today, but I want to kind of give you the highlights of the story as we move through it. So again, last week we saw that Esther was chosen for a purpose, and today we're going to look at how Esther prepared for that purpose. Esther didn't just abandon herself to her fate. Today we're going to see that Esther believed that God had a purpose for her, and she was prepared for that purpose. And in the same way, we should be prepared for God's purpose in our lives. So we're going to jump right into the story. We're going to start in Esther chapter 2. We're going to look at verses 19 through 20. Now, when the virgins were gathered together the second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had not made known her kindred or her people, as Mordecai had commanded her, for Esther obeyed Mordecai just as when she was brought up by him. Now, before we go on, I want to point out Esther's character revealed once again in this chapter. So we spoke last week about Esther's character shining through to such an extent that it was likely that her character was the reason that Xerxes chose her to be the queen. Esther was undoubtedly beautiful, but don't forget that Xerxes had chosen the most beautiful women in the entire empire. They were all part of this competition for the position of queen. And I want to reemphasize her character, especially in the context of the time and the culture. Now, Esther obeyed Mordecai when she was under his authority. We saw that last week. She didn't tell anyone that she was a Jew. So why is it significant for the author to mention that she still obeyed Mordecai? Well, here the text tells us that Esther obeyed Mordecai just as when she was brought up by him. So we have to understand the culture that Esther was living in. In these times, especially in the Jewish community, the father's word was law. Whatever dad said, that was it. That was what happened in the house. Dads, how does that sound? Pretty good, right? But it wasn't just the case when it came to children. The man of the house had absolute authority over his wife and his children. Husbands, how does that sound? The fact that there wasn't a chorus of amens there kind of shows us the difference between our culture and the culture that Esther was raised in. So the understanding of the time was the father had absolute authority over his children, and especially over his daughters, until the daughter was married. And at that time, on the wedding day, the authority passed from the father to the husband. The daughter was no longer required to listen to dad. She now had to listen to her husband. So although Mordecai was not Esther's father, he had raised her. He was the authority figure in her life, and she listened to him and she obeyed him. But now Esther's married. All of her obligation to obey Mordecai is gone, and in fact, not only is Esther married, she is now the queen of the entire empire. She actually has some level of power and authority over Mordecai, and yet she continued to obey Mordecai. I can't think of a better way to display Esther's character and Esther's trust in Mordecai. Now, nowhere in the text do we see that Esther questioned Mordecai's command. Never does she ask why. And the obedience is really important as we proceed through this story. Esther trusted Mordecai, and Esther's character compelled her to continue to obey Mordecai even after her obligation was gone. So I think this trust between Mordecai and Esther and Esther's chosen obedience, I think it's a really valuable insight into Esther's character. But I want to continue here in verse 21 in the story. So in those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Xerxes. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther. And Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. And when the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows. And it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles of the presence of the king. Now, this seems to be a bit of a minor side story in the grand scheme, but it's going to come back later. So we'll leave it here for now, but we'll come back to it in a little bit. And now I kind of want to give you a 30,000-foot overview of the rest of the story. In chapter 3, we are introduced to a man named Haman. I had the opportunity to hear this story told in the traditional Jewish style. I was at a summer camp run by my uncle, and he and his family are Messianic Jews. They live in a Jewish community. They follow Jewish traditions. And so my uncle, as the director of this camp, brought in, I believe it was a Jewish rabbi, it was somebody from the Jewish community, to tell the story of Esther. Now, the Jews tell this story every year at their Purim celebrations. And the story is very interactive when they tell it. So before the man began to tell the story, he passed out noisemakers to the entire crowd. And he explained that it's traditional to make negative noises whenever Haman's name is mentioned in the story. So every time he said Haman, he told the crowd to boo and hiss and use their noisemakers. And it was a really fascinating way to listen to the story. And not only is it kind of fun to be interactive, but it really gave a sense of how hated Haman is and how bad of a character he was in this story. So we meet this man named Haman. Now, Haman is called the Agagite. We may not recognize that name, but the name Agag is often associated with the Amalekites. Now, that is a name we may recognize from the Old Testament. The Amalekites were bitter enemies of the Jews. If you remember, the Amalekites, and especially King Agag, were the people that God commanded King Saul to completely destroy. Now, King Saul disobeyed God, and as a result, the prophet Samuel was told to anoint King David in place of King Saul. And so here we have Mordecai, who, as we learned last week, is a descendant of King Saul, and Haman, who is a descendant of King Agag, now in the same palace. Dun, dun, dun. This is undoubtedly some poetic foreshadowing by the author of the book of Esther. And so Haman, the Agagite, or the Amalekite, was raised to power over everyone else in the king's court. Xerxes made Haman the number 2 man in the entire kingdom. Now, we don't know why Haman received this promotion. It's possible that Haman mistakenly received credit for stopping the assassination attempt that we just read. Based on Persian culture, he likely would have had to do something very significant in order to get this promotion, but we aren't told exactly what he did or why he was promoted. But we do see that the king ordered everyone to bow to Haman when he passed by. Haman was held in high esteem and in high honor in the king's court, so everyone bowed to Haman every time he passed by. Well, everyone except for Mordecai. Now, we in our modern culture, we often believe that Mordecai was standing by his religious convictions in his refusal to bow. It often appears as though he's simply obeying God's law and not bowing to anyone other than God. I don't think that explanation fully holds up, given the culture of the time. This is not necessarily a worshipful bow. It's more of a bow of deference and acknowledgement of Haman's high position. Many scholars, in fact, believe that Mordecai refused to bow because he was a Jew and Haman was an Amalekite. This explanation seems to hold up when we see Haman's reaction to Mordecai's refusal to bow. Haman noticed that Mordecai refused to bow, he was furious. Haman knew that Mordecai was a Jew, and he knew that that was why Mordecai refused to bow. And so Haman made a decision to destroy all of the Jews in the entire empire. Now here we see that Haman is a very crafty guy. He can't just walk into the throne room and demand an ethnic cleansing simply because he doesn't like an individual. Right? So Haman kind of has to come with a very specific allegation. We see that allegation in Esther 3:8. Then Haman said to King Xerxes, "There is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of every other people, and they do not keep the king's laws, so that it is not to the king's profit to tolerate them." Now Haman knew that he couldn't charge the Jews based on religious practice. As powerful and sometimes brutal as Xerxes was, he was fairly religiously tolerant. Haman also couldn't come in and say, "Hey, we have an old blood feud between our people. I'd like to exterminate them." I think Xerxes probably would have told him to kick rocks. So Haman has to come in and kind of invent some charges to get the Jews. He comes in and he says an entire people group is following a law that is antithetical to the king's law. Now, it's possible that Xerxes knew of the Jewish law. It's more likely that once again he called in his lawyers, he called in an expert to hear that there was indeed a people group in the empire that followed a very specific and a very strict law. Now, Xerxes trusted Haman. The Jewish population was likely small enough that Xerxes didn't think their extermination would interrupt the flow of commerce, that it probably wouldn't affect military readiness. So Xerxes signed off on it. I want to consider that for a moment. The king of an empire signed off on the extermination of an entire group of people based on the recommendations of his second in command. Now, if you know what's about to happen in this story, understand Esther is going to be asked to walk into a confrontation with a king who believes that extermination is an acceptable solution to civil disobedience. Now, Haman again showed how crafty he was. He didn't order the military to go in and to kill the Jews. He didn't order all the Jews in the empire to be brought to the capital city and killed. Instead, Haman declared a purge. Now, this is in some ways similar to the Kristallnacht performed by the Nazis in Germany and Austria. On November 9th, in 1938, the Nazi Party under Adolf Hitler launched a terror attack against Jewish citizens. It was later known as Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. And it was a foreshadowing of the coming Holocaust. 100 Jews were killed on that night. Thousands of Jewish businesses, homes, schools, synagogues, and cemeteries were damaged. 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. Emergency first responders were told not to intervene. And this type of government-sponsored terror against the Jews was led by German soldiers in disguise, but it was not solely carried out by German soldiers. It was carried out by citizens as well. The idea was to incite every citizen to attack, kill, and terrorize the Jews living in Germany and Austria. This is basically what Haman says as well. He says, to the people of the empire, on this day, you may kill the Jews. You can take their stuff, take their homes, kill them. That's what you're supposed to do on this day. Jews, you're not allowed to fight back. So the Jews here, they were left with an impossible situation. They were not legally allowed to defend themselves. They were not protected by self-defense laws. There were no stand-your-ground states in the Persian Empire. And so even if they fought back and they survived, they could be charged with murder for unlawfully killing the people who were lawfully trying to kill them. In the same way, you don't have the right to resist arrest, the Jews did not have the right to resist these attacks. And this is why the plot by Haman was so geniusly evil. He didn't have to use government resources to kill the Jews. In fact, he paid the king to allow him to kill the Jews. And all Haman had to do was incentivize the worst in people and not include in the law any ability for the Jews to defend themselves. Now, we're told that the decree went out throughout the entire empire, but the capital city was thrown into confusion. I would imagine that was indeed very confusing. Don't forget that the captured nobility from Israel worked in the palace. There were Jews all throughout Susa. Mordecai was a palace official. It's possible that other Jews were in positions of authority and were known throughout the city. So Mordecai and the Jews throughout the kingdom, they received the news and they went into mourning. And Esther hears about the decree. She hears about Mordecai's mourning, and we're told that she was deeply distressed. And through one of her servants, Esther and Mordecai communicated, and Mordecai commanded Esther to go before the king. I want to look at their exchange here in Esther chapter 4. We're going to read verses 6 through 17. Hathach, that's Esther's servant, went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. And Mordecai told him all that had happened to him, and the exact sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her, and commanded her to go to the king to beg his favor and plead with him on behalf of her people. And Hathach went and told Esther what Mordecai had said. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and commanded him to go to Mordecai and say, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law, to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter so that he may live. But as for me, I have not been called to come into the king these 30 days. And they told Mordecai what Esther had said. And then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf. And do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. And Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. I've waited a while to get to these verses. What an interaction. Mordecai commanded Esther to go to the king and to plead for their lives. And Esther responds, listen, Mordecai, you know the law. If I go in without being called, I'm dead. The only thing that could save me is the king extending his golden scepter, but he hasn't wanted to see me for a month. This is the king, Mordecai, that just set aside the previous queen for not going to a party. Now you're asking me, Mordecai, to go and blatantly disobey the law? Now, let's not forget the charge that Haman brought against the Jews. The charge that Haman brought is that the Jews don't obey the law. This is not a great way to make the case in favor of the Jews. Anyone with siblings has probably experienced this. I love getting together with my family, seeing my parents and my siblings and nieces and nephews. And it's really funny to me when I get to see my siblings parent in the same way that we were parented. So my niece will come out after bedtime. She'll tattle on her brother to my sister. Say, Mom, Liam's talking and he won't stop. Now, sometimes my sister will get up and go deal with Liam, but most of the time her response is, and why are you out of bed when I told you not to come out again? Typically, the strategy of breaking the rules to deal with a rule breaker is not a winning strategy. Coaches tell their players this all the time. The ref usually only sees the second foul. When I was coaching soccer, we had a particularly scrappy midfielder who was very reactionary when she got worked up. She'd get elbowed in the course of a game, and she would immediately just start throwing elbows. And she got called so many times because the ref didn't see the first foul. He only saw her break the rules in response. Now imagine Esther breaking the law to go before the king and say, "We Jews really aren't rule breakers, I promise." She was put in such a difficult situation. Even if the king spared her life, she kind of had a weak case. But Mordecai reminded her that she would not escape. He actually kind of threatens her, not directly, but he says, listen, staying silent, stepping aside, not engaging, that's not going to save you. The Jews, they'll be saved. I'm not worried about that. But you being silent will not be the way that we are saved. And then Mordecai drops this line. I think it's so impactful. He says, "And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" There's no clearer acknowledgement of Mordecai's belief in a purposeful God than this. Esther, this could be it. We didn't know why you were taken away from me and from the rest of your community. We didn't know why your life's dreams and aspirations were tossed aside at the whim of a king. We didn't know why you faced this life of purposeless comfort, but maybe this is it. You see, Mordecai understood that if you believe God has a purpose for you, you have to be prepared for God's purpose. Now, being prepared for God's purpose doesn't mean that we have to set everything else aside. Being prepared for God's purpose doesn't mean that we always have to be in this high state of alert. Being prepared for God's purpose means that when you recognize God's purpose in your life, you accept that purpose and you act on it. And that's exactly what Esther did. She heard these words, she recognized the purpose, and she acted. But the way that Esther acted to fulfill the purpose that God had placed her for is really important. I want to check this out in verse 16. Esther says, "Go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf. And do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." Esther didn't just say, well, let's get this over with and go charging into the throne room. So often, I think we fail to do what Esther did here. Esther's presented with her purpose, and instead of charging into the fray, she did 3 very important things to prepare for that purpose. And the first 2 we see in this verse. So first, Esther prayed. Esther realized that the most important thing she could do to fulfill her purpose was to ensure that she was walking into her purpose wrapped in prayer. She prayed, she fasted, she asked others to join her. All of the Jews in the city were fasting and praying for her. Esther didn't just roll up to the doors of the throne room and throw up a quick Hail Mary or a breathless "God help me." She started with prayer, and she didn't pray alone. She asked others to join her. Esther wanted to be ready to fulfill the purpose that God had called her to, and she knew that the best way to do that would be to start in prayer. And so we see here that for 3 days, Esther fasted and prayed and asked all the Jews to join her in that. But during those 3 days, she was doing more than just praying. We also see that Esther planned. Now, we have this kind of wild perception in Christianity that God's callings don't involve a lot of planning or preparation. I was speaking with John Browning recently. Some of you may remember the Browning family. They were with us for about a year during COVID. John sang on the praise team, had a real nice, deep voice. John's a financial planner, among other things, and Tracy and I have been working with him. And John and I were speaking recently about planning for the financial future. He said something to the effect of, "Josh, don't run away if God gives you opportunities to make money, because lean times will come too. Just plan for those times during the good times. It's okay to plan. Just because God has called us into something doesn't mean that we have to go into that calling half-cocked and without a plan. Esther planned. She said, okay, get everyone together out there. I'll get everyone together in here. We'll pray. So her plan was first and foremost to pray, but then she took time to plan what she would do, what she would say, how she would enter the room. See, Esther knew what the king liked. She had just won the Persia's Next Top Queen contest, right? I don't think she walked in and said, whatever I think of in the moment will be good enough. We're told in the text she put on her royal robes to go in and see the king. She got dolled up. She wanted him to remember not only her position, but the fact that he had chosen her from among all the most beautiful women in the empire. And not only did Esther plan what she was going to wear, she planned her moves. And then finally, Esther proceeded. Esther walked into the throne room wrapped in prayer, her plan ready. All of Esther's prayer and planning led to this one moment. And the king looked up, and he saw Esther across the room. She was looking good. She had on his favorite necklace, that one that he had brought back for her from his latest conquest. She had her hair done in his favorite style. She had her royal robes on. Everyone stopped and stared at her. And the seconds ticked by. And Esther held her breath and waited. King Xerxes extended the golden scepter and welcomed her into his presence. Now, I can only imagine the relief that filled Esther as she approached the throne to present her request. Now her plan could go into motion. Now she could take the steps that she had hoped would save her people. So Xerxes, apparently delighted by the presence of his queen in her royal garb, offered her any request, up to half of his kingdom. Now, this is likely colloquial, but what he's saying is, anything that I can do for you, I will do. And this is where Esther's planning came into play. Esther invited the king to dinner. To dinner? The fate of your people is on the line. You risked your life for a dinner invitation? Now, scholars don't completely agree on Esther's motivations here. Some believe that she lost her nerve and defaulted to a dinner invite. I don't think that's likely. She'd already done the hard part. She'd already entered the throne room. And she had dinner prepared, right? This was a banquet. It's not like she picked up a 12-piece bucket from KFC. The banquet took some preparation and some planning. And I think Esther here is trying to reconnect with Xerxes. He hasn't seen her for 30 days. Now, remember, these marriages were very different. The queen served largely as a symbol, and she, in reality, existed for the enjoyment of the king. So I think that Esther wanted to reconnect with Xerxes. She wanted to remind him of why he liked her. So she invited Xerxes and Haman to dinner. Now, I think she invited Haman for two reasons. One, because she wanted him there when she made the accusation at the second feast. She was going to invite them to. But I think, secondly, she invited him because she wanted the king to be even more furious with him once she revealed that Haman was trying to kill her. They would share these two very special, intimate meals together, and then Esther would accuse one of the guests of trying to annihilate her. Now, we see that Haman felt pretty good about this invitation. He went home. He was in such a great mood that he had a ridiculously tall gallows built specifically for Mordecai. He called all his friends together and told them of his good fortune. He had just had dinner with the king and queen, just the three of them. Now, the next day, Haman was forced to honor Mordecai for saving the king's life. Remember that plot that we read about at the beginning? finally, because of some insomnia, the king remembered Mordecai. And Xerxes called Haman and asked what to do to honor someone the king was pleased with. And Haman thinks, well, of course the king is talking about me, so he came up with a very public reward, which he then had to bestow on Mordecai. Now, this part of the story, it seems to derail the flow of the story a little bit, but remember, Xerxes knew that Mordecai was a Jew. In fact, he called him Mordecai the Jew. The king bestowed a high honor on a Jew for saving the king's life. Mordecai had proven himself a devoted and law-abiding citizen. The king ordered Mordecai's reward on the same day that Esther was going to ask Xerxes to save the Jews. Now imagine if Esther had made her true request in the throne room. Imagine if she hadn't waited and prayed for 3 days before going into the throne room. In that time that Esther was praying and planning, God was working. It's a good thing to take some time to prepare. Sometimes that preparation is for you. I don't believe that Esther could have entered that throne room without divine courage. I don't believe that Xerxes would have read that account of Mordecai without divine prompting. Sometimes that preparation is for you, but sometimes that preparation is for God to work elsewhere. And as we see throughout this entire book, God does everything for a purpose. So if you believe that God has a purpose for you, you have to be prepared for God's purpose. Now, we sometimes have this strange way of thinking as Christians. We sometimes think that God's purposes for us are necessarily painful or difficult. We sometimes think that God won't call us into things that we might thrive in, but that's completely against what we know about God. God doesn't call everyone to be Esther. God doesn't call everyone to be the Apostle Paul. We just spent 2 years looking through the book of Acts and watching Paul go through some really difficult and challenging situations in order to fulfill his purpose. But we're not all called to be Esther or Paul. Instead, maybe our purpose is closer to what Paul encourages the Thessalonian church to in 1 Thessalonians 4:10 through 12. He says, "Yet we urge you, brothers and sisters, to do so more and more and to make it your ambition to lead a quiet life. You should mind your own business and work with your hands, just as we told you, so that your daily life may win the respect of outsiders, and so that you will not be dependent on anybody." Maybe God's purpose for you is to lead a quiet life, so that your daily life might win the respect of outsiders. But regardless of the purpose that God has called you to, you should be prepared for God's purpose, whether God's purpose is a quiet life or an extremely difficult situation like Esther faced here. Esther's purpose was to live in comfort for a time and to win the respect of outsiders, but when the difficult moment came, Esther didn't retreat to comfort. I think this is what Mordecai was reminding Esther of when he told her that if she stayed silent, God would still deliver the Jews. You see, God doesn't need us to fulfill the purpose that he has for us. He has other ways of getting stuff done. But I believe that God chooses us for a purpose and uses us for a purpose so that we can participate in the work that he is doing throughout the world. This is something that I've kind of struggled to get my mind around. God doesn't need me, so why does God choose to use me? Well, God chooses to use me because he's made me and designed me and prepared me and chosen me for a purpose. I think God uses us for his purposes for our benefit. I want to show you why I think that. I want to share with you a verse that we so often hear out of context. Here it is, Romans 8:28. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. But are you ready for the context of that verse? Romans 8:26 through 31 says, "Likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. For we do not know what to pray for as we ought, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words. And he who searches hearts knows what is the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he might be the firstborn among many brothers. And those whom he predestined, he also called. And those whom he called, he also justified. And those whom he justified, he also glorified. What then shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? Paul's not saying that everything is going to work out for us the way that we want it to. Paul is saying that for those of us who have been called to God's purpose, and by the way, if you're a believer, that's you. If you're a believer, you have been called into God's purpose. God says, for those of you who are called according to God's purpose, God is going to work things together to accomplish his purpose. And maybe he gives the king heartburn the night after a feast. Maybe he puts a scared Jewish girl in the palace of a king. Maybe he puts the right people in your life or in your path so that you will be able to accomplish his purpose. But let me tell you this, if you're not prepared to accomplish God's purpose, you're going to have a hard time getting it done. And Mordecai reminded Esther that God doesn't need her, but that maybe God placed her for his purposes, and now she gets to be a part of what God is doing. Paul says that God predestines, conforms, calls, justifies, and glorifies. If God's working, no one can stop him. If God's going to accomplish something, and he's calling you into a purpose, understand he doesn't need you to accomplish his purpose, but he wants to use you because that's what he has remade and called you for. Now, if being called into something that God is doing doesn't sound like something you want to be involved in, can I encourage you to ask yourself why? Just ask yourself, why don't I want to be used for God's purpose? Now, there's so many potential answers here. And maybe we're afraid it will be uncomfortable. Maybe we're afraid it will disrupt our plans. Maybe we're afraid it will take us away from the vision that we have for our lives. But can I point you back to the story of Esther? All of those things happened to her. We read this story from beginning to end, and we admire how she responded to the situation that she was placed in. We read Esther's story, and it's immediately obvious that God had chosen Esther for a purpose and that she was placed for a purpose. And we marvel at how she prepared for her purpose, but that's only because we can read the entire story. Imagine living Esther's life. Why is her story one that we can admire? Because even in the midst of tremendous disappointment and fear and difficulty and anger, Esther prayed and planned and proceeded with her purpose. And next week, we're going to see how God used her for tremendous good. Now, for those of you sitting here today, you're saying, man, I'm on board. I want to be ready and prepared for God's purpose in my life. Well, how can you prepare? How can you be prepared to fulfill God's purpose in your life? I want to answer that with the story of Esther. First, pray. We saw last week in Philippians 2:13, for it is God who works in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. Pray and ask God to work in you so that you are prepared to fulfill your purpose. Pray that you won't miss the purpose that God calls you to. Pray that if God calls you to a more specific purpose, you will not let it pass you by for the sake of comfort or preference or safety. Now let me encourage you here. Some of you may be asking, but Josh, how do I find God's specific purpose for my life? I don't know. Mordecai didn't definitively tell Esther that she had been placed for that specific purpose. What Mordecai did was he recognized the situation and he recognized the unique position that Esther had been put in. And even then, he didn't tell her, this is definitely what God has for you. This is his specific purpose. No, Mordecai approached the situation with humility. He says, who knows? Maybe this is it. If it isn't, God will find another way. Just make sure, Esther, that you don't miss out on being used by God for his specific purpose. It takes prayer and humility to recognize a specific calling for your life. We may not be specifically called to a purpose for such a time as this. We won't all be called to be Esther. Now, does that mean we don't have a purpose? Of course not. We talked about our purpose last week. We're chosen to be different. Paul reiterates that in the 1 Thessalonians verses that we read today. Live a peaceful life, work hard, win the respect of outsiders, be different. But sometimes with humility, we recognize that maybe we were called for such a time as this. And if that happens through prayer and through humility, when you see and recognize that calling, plan. Plan. How will you be different? What will you do to make sure that you live in God's purpose every day? This doesn't just happen. We have to plan to be successful in fulfilling our purpose. And if God calls us to something more specific, what will my response look like? How will I respond? How will I tell my family? What steps will I take to confirm God's calling, and how will I go about pursuing it? Are you mentally prepared to follow God into a specific purpose? Are you financially prepared to follow God into your daily purpose or into a specific purpose? If not, that's why we host Financial Peace University classes here. If you missed the one that's currently going on, let us know that you're interested. We can schedule another class. You can also do it yourself online. Financial Peace University is such a great opportunity to learn about getting your finances to work for you so that you can fulfill your purpose regardless of what or where it is. Now, maybe you felt God tugging you towards a specific purpose. Maybe your planning needs to get a little more specific. I don't know what that might look like for you. Planning might mean going back to school. Planning might mean learning a new skill. It might mean moving to a new country or a new city. Planning might mean having conversations that make you uncomfortable. It might mean something really small or something really drastic. For Esther, her plan included risking her life. I don't know what God is going to call you to, but I can guarantee that whatever God calls you to, you don't want to walk into it without a plan. You know the purpose that God has called you to, and he may call you to a more specific purpose, but either way, have a plan. And then finally, proceed. If you've prayed and you've planned, proceed. Go for it. Walk into that throne room and present that dinner invitation. God has some amazing things planned for you. We know that we as believers are called into God's purpose each and every day, and sometimes he calls us that more specific purpose, so every day, go for it. Now, if you're sitting here today and you aren't a believer, let me tell you this. There is no greater purpose in life than the purpose that God calls you to. You will find, you will create, you will experience no greater purpose than the purpose that is found in the person of Jesus Christ and the purpose that is given to you once you join his family. I don't know if God has a specific calling prepared for you, but I do know that we are designed to be conformed to the likeness of Jesus. As believers, our purpose is to be different. If you are called to no other specific purpose in your life, you are called to be different, to be conformed to the likeness of Jesus. Have you started that journey? Have you joined that purpose? Do you know what it means to be called? If you don't know Jesus, he is welcoming you. He is inviting you into his family. Jesus is calling you to a purpose more wonderful than anything you can imagine, and you will never experience a greater purpose than living a life conformed to the image of Jesus Christ. And that's something that's very easy to start. If you recognize that you are a sinner in need of a Savior, all you have to do is acknowledge that Jesus is Lord and accept God's free gift of forgiveness of sin and salvation from condemnation. That's it. If you want to live in the purpose that God has called you to, that's the first step on the journey. And I invite you to take that step this morning and join the family of God. And brothers and sisters, you were called for a purpose. Are you ready to fulfill it? If not, why not? Go after that answer. Answer that question. But if you are prepared to fulfill God's purpose for your life, pray, plan, and finally proceed in the purpose to which you were called. Let's pray. Jesus, we thank you so much for calling us as your children, for calling us to be a part of what you are doing around the world. God, we know that you can do all things. We know that you can work in spite of us, God, but you invite us to be a part of your purpose. You invite us to be a part of what you have going on. And that is such an amazing, amazing privilege. Lord, we know that in order to fulfill the purpose that you have called us to, we actually have to put some work in. We have to put some preparation, some planning in so that we can fulfill your purpose for us every day. Lord, this week, this month, as we move forward, Father, I ask that you would help us as we prepare, as we pray, as we plan, and as we proceed in the purpose that you have called us to. And Father, I ask that through the people here in International, through your church globally, Lord, that you would work in great and powerful ways. Lord, and that we would see you move. Jesus, we love you, and I thank you so much for your love for us. It's in your name that we pray. Amen.